Self-doubt is not a stranger to any of us. It is an intimate companion, often unwelcome, yet persistent. It whispers in our minds not as an external force, but as if it were our own voice. And therein lies its power. If your enemy were external, you could fight it, resist it, or flee. But when the voice of doubt masquerades as your truest self, how do you respond? Do you obey its commands? Do you argue with it? Or do you simply accept its judgments as truth, allowing it to steer your decisions, shape your relationships, and define your sense of worth? If we are honest, most of the time we obey. But why? Why do we treat this voice as if it holds some divine authority over us? Socrates, the ancient philosopher condemned for corrupting the youth of Athens, would tell us that the unexamined life is not worth living. And yet, here we are, living largely unexamined lives, allowing self-doubt to govern us without ever asking, what is this voice? Where does it come from? And most importantly, why do I believe it? Let's begin by asking a harder question. What if the voice of doubt is not actually you? This may sound strange, even absurd at first. After all, the voice feels like it is you. It seems to know your weaknesses, your failures, your fears. It speaks in your tone, using your memories as ammunition. But Socrates would challenge us immediately. He would ask, how can you claim it is you if you are also the one who hears it? When you hear the voice of doubt, there is a listener within you. There is a part of you that notices this voice, that feels its effects, and that decides how to respond. Do you see the distinction? If you can hear it, observe it, and even argue with it, then the voice cannot be the entirety of who you are. There is something else within you, something quieter, deeper, and often overlooked.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
And this is where the 30-second hack comes into play. Socrates often used a method of inquiry that disarmed his opponents, not by outwitting them, but by forcing them to confront their own assumptions. The next time self-doubt arises within you, I want you to do this pause for 30 seconds and ask yourself, who is speaking right now? It's such a simple question, but its implications are vast. Who is this voice that claims I am not good enough, not smart enough, not capable enough? Is it truly me? Or is it some inherited belief, some past experience, some echo of a critical voice I heard long ago? When you ask this question, something remarkable happens. The voice of self-doubt loses its footing. It stumbles, because it cannot withstand scrutiny. It relies on your passive acceptance to thrive. The moment you turn your attention to it, the moment you question its origin and its authority, it begins to weaken. But let's not stop there. Let's go deeper. Why does this voice exist at all? Why would we, as rational beings, harbor a part of ourselves that undermines us, that questions our worth and limits our potential? Socrates would remind us that every phenomenon has a reason. Nothing exists without a cause. Self-doubt is not some random flaw in our psychology. It has a function. Its purpose, at its core, is protection. It arises from a deeply ingrained fear of failure, rejection, or humiliation. It is your mind's way of trying to keep you safe from pain. But here's the problem in its attempt to protect you. Self-doubt often creates the very pain it seeks to avoid. It prevents you from taking risks, pursuing your dreams, or expressing your true self. It traps you in a prison of inaction, where the fear of failure is replaced by the certainty of regret. Now let me ask you something. If you had a friend who constantly discouraged you, who always pointed out your flaws and told you to play small, would you call that person a friend? Would you trust their advice? Or would you recognize their negativity for what it is, a projection of their own fears, their own insecurities? So why do we trust the voice of self-doubt? Why do we give it so much power? Socrates would say that we trust it because we have not examined it. We have not questioned its motives, its origins, or its truthfulness. We have simply accepted it as part of who we are. But here's the truth: the voice of self-doubt is not you. It is a habit of thought, a pattern that has been reinforced over time. And like any habit, it can be changed. But change requires awareness. It requires us to step outside of ourselves, to observe the voice without judgment, and to recognize it for what it is: a protective mechanism that has outlived its usefulness. I want you to try something right now. Think of a moment in your life when self-doubt held you back. Maybe it was a job you didn't apply for, a relationship you didn't pursue, or a dream you didn't chase. Hold that moment in your mind. Now imagine what could have been different if, in that moment, you had paused for 30 seconds and asked yourself, who is speaking right now? Would you have seen through the illusion? Would you have acted differently? The beauty of Socrates' hack is its simplicity. It doesn't require you to silence the voice or fight it. It simply asks you to observe it, to question it, and in doing so, to separate yourself from it. This separation is the key to freedom, because the moment you realize that the voice of doubt is not you, it loses its power. But this is only the beginning. Recognizing the voice is the first step. The next step is learning how to respond to it. And this is where we must turn to the wisdom of Socrates once again. For he understood that true confidence is not the absence of doubt, but the ability to act in spite of it. So let me leave you with this question, one that Socrates self might have asked if he were here today: if the voice of self-doubt is not you, then who are you? And what might you be capable of if you stop believing everything it says? If we accept that self-doubt is not truly us, but rather a voice that arises within us, then the next question becomes, what do we do when it speaks? How you respond to the voice of doubt will define the trajectory of your life. Do you let it paralyze you, or do you meet it with the wisdom and courage it lacks? Socrates taught that wisdom begins with understanding what you do not know. This is not a call to weakness, but to clarity. Most of us, when faced with self-doubt, immediately try to silence it or push it aside. We force ourselves into a false sense of confidence, pretending the doubt isn't there. But consider this: if you deny its existence, doesn't it often return even stronger, louder, and more insistent? To respond to self-doubt effectively, we must first understand its nature. Self-doubt thrives on certainty. It speaks in absolutes: you can't do this, you're not good enough, you'll fail. Its strength lies in the illusion that its claims are facts, rather than mere thoughts. Socrates would urge us to challenge this so-called certainty, not by rejecting it outright, but by questioning it. When doubt arises, ask, is this true? For instance, if the voice says, you're not good enough to succeed, pause and examine it. What does good enough even mean? Good enough for whom? By what standard? And who set that standard in the first place? Most of the time you will find that self-doubt offers no real answers. It is vague, imprecise, and riddled with assumptions. And when you expose its lack of substance, it begins to crumble. This is the power of questioning, of refusing to take the voice of doubt at face value. But questioning is not enough. Once you have stripped self-doubt of its false authority, you must replace it with something stronger. Here is where Socrates' philosophy becomes most practical. He believed that the way we speak to ourselves shapes not only our thoughts but our reality. If the voice of self-doubt speaks in absolutes, then we must learn to speak back with clarity, intention, and truth. Been asked to give a presentation at work, and the voice in your head says, "You're terrible at public speaking." You're going to embarrass yourself. Notice how the voice assumes failure as a foregone conclusion. It doesn't leave room for nuance or possibility. Now, instead of accepting this statement, respond to it as Socrates would by asking questions and offering counter-arguments. For example, am I really terrible at public speaking? Or have there been moments when I've done it well? Even if I feel nervous, does that automatically mean I'll fail? What's the worst that could happen if I make a mistake? Will it truly define me? Do you see what's happening here? By engaging with the voice of doubt, you create space. You interrupt its narrative and introduce a new perspective, one that is grounded in reality rather than fear. But let's take this a step further. Socrates believed that actions, not just thoughts, reveal the truth of who we are. If you want to crush self-doubt, you cannot simply argue with it in your mind. You must act in defiance of it. Here's the paradox: the more you wait for confidence to act, the more power self-doubt gains. Confidence is not something you acquire by thinking, it is something you build by doing. Every time you take action in the face of doubt, you weaken its grip and strengthen your belief in yourself. Think of it like this: self-doubt is like a shadow. It seems large and intimidating, but only because you are standing still. The moment you move toward it, you realize it has no substance. It cannot stop you unless you allow it to. But let's be honest, acting in the face of doubt is not easy. It requires courage, and courage is not the absence of fear, it is the willingness to move forward despite it. Socrates would remind us that courage is a skill, and like any skill, it can be developed through practice. Start small. Identify one area of your life where self-doubt holds you back. It could be speaking up in meetings, pursuing a creative project, or setting boundaries in a relationship. Choose a single, manageable action that challenges the voice of doubt. Maybe it's raising your hand in one meeting, writing the first page of your project, or saying no to one unreasonable request. When you take this action, pay attention to what happens. Does the world fall apart? Do you lose everything you feared losing? Or do you discover that the voice of self-doubt was exaggerating, that its warnings were not as dire as they seemed? This is the essence of Socrates' 30-second hack. By pausing to question the voice of doubt and taking even the smallest action against it, you begin to unravel its power. You learn through experience that you are capable of more than you believed. But let me ask you something deeper. If you succeed in acting despite your self-doubt, what does that say about the nature of doubt itself? If you can overcome it, doesn't that prove it was never real to begin with? And yet, there is a danger here. Sometimes when we challenge self-doubt, it doesn't disappear, it evolves. It becomes more cunning, more sophisticated. It may even disguise itself as wisdom or humility, convincing you that playing small is the sensible or mature choice. This is why Socrates warned against complacency. The moment you think you have conquered self-doubt, it will find a new way to infiltrate your mind. Your task is not to eliminate it entirely, that is impossible. Your task is to remain vigilant, to recognize its many forms, and to respond with both clarity and action. And here, we must confront a harsh truth. Self-doubt is not always the result of external forces or past experiences. Sometimes we cling to it because it is familiar. It gives us an excuse to avoid risk, to stay within our comfort zones, to avoid the possibility of failure. So let me ask you, what do you gain from holding on to your self-doubt? Does it protect you from pain, or does it keep you from the life you truly want? Socrates would tell us that the greatest obstacle to growth is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge, and self-doubt is nothing if not an illusion. It pretends to know the future, to predict your failures, to define your limits. But in reality, it knows nothing. It is as blind as it claims you to be. So the next time self-doubt arises, remember this: you do not have to believe it. You do not have to obey it. You have the power to question it, to act against it, and to prove it wrong. And if you need proof of this power, look back on your own life. Think of the moments when you doubted yourself but acted anyway. What did you discover about your strength, your resilience, your potential? What might you discover next if you refuse to let self-doubt hold you back? If you've begun questioning the voice of self-doubt and taken even a single step in defiance of it, you've likely felt a subtle shift in the dynamic of your mind. The voice that once seemed so overwhelming, so all-encompassing, now feels smaller, less stable. But let's not mistake this for victory just yet. Self-doubt is not merely a voice in your head, it is a pattern. And patterns, by their nature, tend to repeat unless broken with intention. Socrates understood human nature profoundly. He believed that much of what we consider ourselves is not actually who we are, but a collection of habits, beliefs, and influences we've absorbed from the world around us. In the case of self-doubt, we must ask, where did this pattern begin? Whose voice are we really hearing when we doubt ourselves? Think about it for a moment. Are the doubts you carry truly your own, or are they echoes of others? Perhaps it's the voice of a parent who was overly critical, or a teacher who dismissed your potential, or a society that constantly measures you against impossible standards. When self-doubt arises, are you hearing your own wisdom, or are you replaying the judgments and fears of others? Here's a hard truth we must confront: much of our self-doubt is inherited. It is not the result of conscious thought, but of unconscious absorption. As children, we are sponges, taking in the words, attitudes, and beliefs of those around us. If someone told you, explicitly or implicitly, that you weren't good enough, smart enough, or capable enough, those messages likely lodge themselves deep in your psyche. And even if those voices are long gone, their echoes remain, shaping the way you see yourself in the world. But here is the paradox: if self-doubt is not truly yours, why do you carry it as if it were? Why do you let the judgments of others define your sense of worth? Socrates would remind us that no one can harm your soul without your consent. The opinions of others, no matter how harsh or persistent, only have power over you if you accept them as truth. And yet we often do. We internalize the judgments of others because at some level we believe they know us better than we know ourselves. But let me ask you, who knows your potential better than you? Who else has lived every moment of your life, felt every one of your struggles, and dreamed every one of your dreams? If you could see yourself through the eyes of Socrates, you would recognize that no one, no parent, no teacher, no critic has greater authority over your life than you do. And yet, reclaiming this authority is not easy. It requires us to confront the beliefs we've carried for years, even decades, and to ask, are these beliefs true? Or have I been living someone else's story? Let's examine this together. Imagine you have a belief that says, I'm not creative. Where did this belief come from? Was it based on a single moment, a failed art project, a teacher's criticism, a comparison to someone more talented? Or was it repeated to you over and over until you accepted it as fact? Now consider this: if this belief were removed from your mind entirely, how might you behave differently? Would you pick up a paintbrush, write a poem, or start a project you've been putting off? What could you create if the belief "I'm not creative" ceased to exist? This exercise reveals something profound: beliefs are not fixed truths. They are stories we tell ourselves, often without questioning their origins or validity. And if a belief is just a story, it can be rewritten. Socrates would challenge us to rewrite these stories by returning to the source of our inner authority. He believed that each of us has a kind of inner daimonion, a guiding voice of reason and intuition that can lead us toward truth. But this voice is often drowned out by the noise of self-doubt, fear, and external influence. To hear your inner voice, you must create space for it. Silence is essential here, not the absence of sound, but the absence of distraction. When was the last time you truly sat with yourself, without a phone, a screen, or a task to occupy your mind? When was the last time you listened, not to the voice of doubt, but to the quieter, wiser voice beneath it? This is not an easy practice. The mind, like a restless child, will resist silence. It will fill the void with chatter, with worries, with judgments. But if you persist, if you sit long enough, you will begin to hear something different. You will hear the voice that says, "You are enough," the voice that says, "You are capable," the voice that says, "You are more than the sum of your fears." And once you hear this voice, you must act on it. Remember, Socrates taught that wisdom is worthless without action. If your inner voice tells you to take a risk, to pursue a passion, to stand up for yourself, then you must do so even if self-doubt persists. This brings us to a critical point. Reclaiming your inner authority does not mean eliminating doubt altogether. Doubt will always exist because uncertainty is a part of life. But what changes is your relationship to doubt. Instead of letting it control you, you learn to coexist with it. You recognize it as a natural part of being human, but you no longer let it dictate your choices. Let me ask you something radical. What if self-doubt is not your enemy but your teacher? What if its presence is not a sign of weakness, but a reminder that you are stepping outside your comfort zone, pushing the boundaries of what you thought possible? Think about it. When do you feel the most doubt? Is it not when you are on the verge of something meaningful, starting a new job, pursuing a creative dream, or sharing your true self with someone? Self-doubt arises in these moments because they matter. It arises because you are growing, and growth is always accompanied by discomfort. So maybe the presence of doubt is not a reason to stop, but a signal to keep going. Maybe it is not a barrier, but a threshold. And maybe the question is not how to silence doubt, but how to move forward in its presence. Socrates would encourage us to embrace this perspective. He would remind us that the greatest achievements in life are born not from certainty, but from courage. And courage, as we've said before, is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to act despite it. The next time self-doubt arises, try this. Instead of resisting it, acknowledge it. Say to yourself, "I see you, I hear you, but you do not define me." Then take one small step forward, just one. And when you do, notice what happens. Does the doubt grow stronger, or does it begin to fade? Do you feel smaller, or does some part of you expand? What might happen if you repeated this process every day, every time doubt arose? Socrates believed that the truth is not something we find, it is something we create through our actions, our choices, and our willingness to question everything, including ourselves. What truth might you create if you stop letting self-doubt tell your story?